NASA says this second is the best and open door to focus in on the world Venus. This follows the new revelation of conceivable life in the world. Expecting that you some way or another wound up exploring NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the Space Association calling Venus a planet from judgment. Meanwhile, Mars changed into our destiny target. Such cautious naming of the most significant planets isn't an occasion. During the irate space race period, the Soviet affiliation was based on sending exorbitant missions to Venus. The ghastly planet showed essentially no amazing open doors forever. As of now, the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the domain. Considering Neil deGrasse Tyson, we at long last understand the motivation behind why. Oblige us as we analyze the declassified photographs from Venus taken by the Soviet affiliation. The fall of the Soviet affiliation was dynamic in additional ways than one, despite the way that it changed the worldwide course of the world. However, the absence of the domain moreover sank different insider facts with it. The way that the Soviets had a critical preference for secrets, from running the most noteworthy inside office on Earth to being surreptitious about their expected extraterrestrial contact, infers the past superpower holds different favored mysteries inside itself. In all honesty, before the US of America administered most planetary endeavors in space, the Soviet affiliation was driving the game. While the domain has a long history of productive and unbeneficial space missions, its most prominent obsession was on the strongly threatening planet, Venus. In the Russian language, you'd consider Venus to be Venera, and in this manner the name of the mission that crossed from 1961 to 1983. During similar time, the US of America was occupied with sending its missions to the moon. Thus, in a savvy way, the Soviets chose to utilize their assets somewhere else. We can't say that the whole fixation on the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets hope to use the planet's surface as a judicious and extraordinary armed force foundation, or would they say they were perhaps wanting to colonize the planet straightforwardly following looking for any sorts of life up there? It's incredibly challenging to say why the domain was centered around the horrendous planet. Since the Soviets chose these assessment outings during the virus war, they weren't unequivocally approaching with their places and targets. Truly, all that we are familiar the Venusian missions relies upon declassified and unarchived verification, and still at the end of the day, it's difficult to pinpoint what the Soviets were looking for, and assuming they revealed the secrets of Venus. The Soviets didn't show up on Venus once, 2 times, or even multiple times. That is essentially straightforward. The Soviets shipped off 28 expensive rockets to the dazzling planet, and 13 of those entered the Venusian air, while 8 landed. Such mind-boggling missions had set the Soviets in a main situation in space investigation. Of course, the US of America was a nearby second. As of now, NASA was more enchanted by satellites and inventive arrangements than exploring life on planets. Its gleam for Mars came, therefore, neither particularly extraordinary nor particularly terrible. Your arrangement of history perusing material may not let you know this, but rather the Soviet space program was the primary association to send a test into the environment of a planet other than Earth. It likewise had one more stack of firsts on its resume. The USSR transformed into the essential state to achieve a sensitive arrival on another planet. Bringing back pictures and sounds from the external layer of another planet was speedy. That is right. The Soviets had their own one little step for man, one monster jump for humankind, second well before the US. Anyway, for what reason do we seldom learn about such accomplishment missions? Recall the thing we said about the Soviet bias for staying quiet? That is only one of the many purposes behind the oversight of the Soviet space program. Back in 1992, the prestigious affiliation was decommissioned in the outcome of the USSR, and the affiliation must be re-established with another Russian character, Roscosmos. A great deal of its verifiable information was either lost or crushed. This is definitively why we don't have an unambiguous reaction for why the Soviets shipped off 28 transports into the Venusian environment. In any case, in the event that we expected to make the most veritable gauge, maybe the Soviet choice to explore Venus was about cost proficiency more than whatever else. It isn't really the situation that the space program wasn't sure about the reasonability of the planet. They were searching for effective water presence, power of sun-oriented radiation, and the general characteristics of the planet. Without a progression of these space missions, it would have been beyond difficult to measure Venus' high temperatures and thick climate. Today, different cosmologists don't actually accept that the threatening planet could uphold life. The temperatures up there are adequately high to dissolve lead, and water is sparse. Besides, because of its thick climate, the barometric strain on Venus is on various events that of Earth. In any case, these are very late and current upgrades, and to dismiss the USSR's commitment to the assessment of Venus is comparable to modifying history. Considering everything, Venus justified investigating, whether or not it was to work up the space race. Investigating more affable planets like Mars wasn't exactly off the table, however it was more exorbitant than sending tests to Venus. All that simply boils down to the separation from Earth to another wonderful body. All things considered, is 250 million kilometers away. Such epic contrasts in distance add up to progressive contrasts in cost. Also, in the event that the US of America wasn't the world's biggest economy, it couldn't have ever been. Simple to investigate Mars. Different reports recommend that Soviet missions were temperamental and had huge specialized holes. Obviously, the shuttle weren't fit to cover huge distances. Moreover, the organization had a sad history of losing contact with its rockets, so it looks at why the Soviet space program was picking a more limited and closer trip that would yield results. Nonetheless, in the event that we don't consider the space race in this unique circumstance, the story of the Venera missions would be fragmented. The US of America wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program shipped off the principal counterfeit satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This move escalated the space tussle and kept up with its power. In any case, what's really fascinating is the reason the US focused in on the moon. Close to cloud destinations, NASA had a progression of disillusionments with its Venus missions during the 1960s. The U.S. Space Office ended up in a gridlock called the Venus Revile. Each time they shipped off a test into the Venusian environment, it ended up being terrible. This is precisely whenever the Soviet affiliation saw an opportunity to take advantage of NASA's mistake. Around that time, both the U.S. and the still up in the air to dominate the competition in the space race. The most reasonable endeavor was to take full advantage of two unmistakable choices. It was a defining moment. Convincingly, the Soviet space program clutched Earth's sister planet as the best accomplishment in the space tussle, achieving something that its significant partner had neglected to do. Regardless of the domain's restricted assets and botching government, it over and over sent missions to Venus to get its triumphant situation against the US. Rather than NASA's accentuation on the moon, this key division wasn't without ill will and eluding openness to conceal their critical dissatisfactions with Venus. The American office was incited to stigmatize the USSR's obsession with the world. In famous media, Venus was named the unpleasant planet while Mars turned into man's fate. These names didn't make any difference to the Soviets. Their principal objective was to display prevalence over the Americans, and they weren't vain in doing as such. The Venera missions are nearly disregarded in present history. Coincidentally, despite their dated starting points, those missions were fundamentally mind-boggling, progressed, and aggressive. In actuality, if we truly need to pick an occasion that undeniable the start of the space age, the Venera assessments would stand out. Thinking back to the 1950s, the Soviets started to attempt various things with the plan and specialized subtleties of the tests, and for the following 30 years, they continued to fabricate and ship off interplanetary shuttle as a piece of the Venera program. Since the program was running close by an especially vicious virus war, the Soviets were centered around smoothing out their resources. Fortunately for them, the early long stretches of the contention gave them more really troublesome work limit than the US of America. That advantage turned out to be exceptionally useful for expanding on their capacities. The USSR started to gather and ship off bigger rockets that were planned to persevere through high rises and long lengths. The Soviets raced to attempt various things with both monitored and automated shuttle. Meanwhile, the Soviet scholarly local area was dealing with a progression of assessments to make definite headings for the Venus missions. Behind the scenes, their Mars programs were likewise running successfully. For the Soviet Space Office, nothing was a higher priority than creating complex instrumentation for these tests. This prompted the best jump forward throughout the entire existence of room investigation. In 1966, the Soviet Association shipped off Venera 3, making it the principal fake test to enter the environment of Venus and actually associate with the planet's surface. This significant achievement reinforced the opposition between the two superpowers. Not at all like the American missions, which were loaded up with frustrations and gridlocks, the Soviet program kept on gaining ground. No matter what the program's sluggish headway, the USSR figured out how to send fruitful tests into the Venusian environment. The main pressing concern with this approach was restricted plan limit. The Soviets rapidly defeated their plan issues and shipped off the most exceptional rockets of the Venera program during the 1970s. Their characterizing accomplishment during the 1970s, the Soviet program was entering the most moderate time frame.